Welcome to WCG Talks Trials, the podcast where we dive deep into the world of clinical research, sharing the latest trends, insights, and best practices from experts across the industry. In each episode of WCG Talks Trials, we'll explore a different area of the clinical trial industry, while featuring a diverse range of clinical research and medical professionals. If you're passionate about advancing clinical research, improving patient outcomes, and driving healthcare forward, then WCG Talks Trials is the right podcast for you. We are so glad you could join us today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Desiree Underwood, Director of the Project Management Office at WCG, and I'm thrilled to be your host for today's episode, recapping the latest Patient Forum focus session on community engagement and diving more into some of the themes discussed. Before we get started, let me remind you to subscribe to our podcast and follow us on your favorite listening platforms like Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Spotify, so you never miss an episode of WCG Talks Trials. We are joined today by Steve Smith, CEO of Steve Smith Plans, LLC, and the facilitator of the WCG Patient Forum. Thank you so much for joining us today, Steve. Before we get started, I'll share a little bit about my background and how I got into clinical research. And then, Steve, we're going to pass it to you so that you can share a little bit about what prompted you to get into clinical research. So as mentioned earlier, I am Director of the Project Management Office at WCG. Most of my experience prior to joining WCG was in direct patient care and facilitating clinical trials. And then once joining WCG, I started to work in site management and process improvement and project management to ensure that our clinical trials run smoothly. So that's a little bit about me. Steve, let us know what prompted you to get into clinical research.
Thank you for having me on this great program, Desiree. It's a pleasure to be on WCG Talks Trials and also to be interviewed by you with all of your experience in clinical research and the insight that you have running the project management office at WCG. A lot of us who are focused on what is happening in the homes of patients, in the lives of patients during their hospitalizations or their clinical research visits, or just their regular lives, I'll say. A lot of those things are really an area of concern that is alleviated by the people that do work like you do. If we think of clinical trials, without project management, things just wouldn't happen as fast as they do. Time is of the essence for patients. They wouldn't happen as well. There wouldn't be as many FDA approvals. So it's really a pleasure to be able to meet you and be interviewed by you and work with you. You asked me how I got involved in clinical research. It started when my 3-year-old was diagnosed with a rare disease some years ago, for which there was no FDA-approved treatment. And like many parents, I was thrust into this because of that, and I didn't really know that much about clinical trials or clinical research. But families have learned how fast we all become experts because we get in there and find out there's a lot to know, and because it pertains to our children, our own children, it is very interesting, and relationships ensue. We start to meet the physicians that focus on those, in my case, very rare disease. And we find out it's a world of physicians and researchers coming from many countries together because these are rare things. They want to collaborate with each other. And as we learn the importance of collaboration and the difference it makes, then we start to also learn the difference we can make by collaborating as families of children with rare diseases or individuals who ourselves may have disease. So that's how I got involved.
That's awesome. Steve, thanks so much for sharing your personal story. Now let's dive into our topic for today's episode. So in the last Patient Forum focus session, we discussed sickle cell anemia and melanoma. Can you share a little background about how the participants and their families from this latest session have been impacted by a medical diagnosis?
Yes, and I'll say that like all the Patient Forum interviews, this last broadcast that you're referring to consists of 3 interviews with 3 different individuals. 2 of them spoke about sickle cell disease and one of them spoke about melanoma. But what they said is very generalizable across many other diseases because of the way they are talking about how science is helping and how the research is coming together, and also some of the things patient families go through. So you asked what these individuals went through. Two of them come from families where there is sickle cell. One of them is a professor who herself has sickle cell disease and was diagnosed as a child. And so she remembers growing up, she says, being told you can't play with other children exactly the same way they're all playing. There are things you're going to need to do that are different because of sickle cell disease. She said that's how it began. The other speaker, whose sister had sickle cell disease and passed away at age 41 from it, talks about growing up with a sister that has sickle cell disease, her mom, her dad, herself, her sister, and the impact on their family, which was great and very profound. And how she said, my sister did have a good life, but there was a lot of pain and suffering and hospitalizations and things that all of us would find unpleasant and scary. Both of them talked about how much they appreciate the clinical research world, and both of them actually work in the clinical research world to try to make it better for people with sickle cell. The third speaker spoke about melanoma, and what she said is also generalizable to many others. For example, she herself had a diagnosis of a totally different disease, which was esophageal cancer, which was a very serious diagnosis, which as a patient advocate, she herself advocated for herself to get better treatment than the doctors were prescribing for her, possibly saving her own life in collaboration with the medical community. So that was esophageal cancer, but now she is head of communications and engagement for the Melanoma Research Foundation. All of these people are speaking of something very real to them, but which I think patients and their families with many other diseases will also relate to.
I agree. I think it's so relatable that, for the Patient Forum, you interviewed and included individuals who are directly impacted by the diseases that we're mentioning. So there's a lot going on in clinical research right now. Can you share with everyone why sickle cell disease and melanoma are in focus right now?
Yes. For a long time, and I'll use sickle cell as the example, but we've had other speakers in other years on this patient forum as well, talking about drug development for sickle cell disease. The drug development research has been going on for decades, and there have been drug approvals along the way, none of which really provide total relief or enough relief. So that sickle cell up until recently is a disease characterized by acute pain episodes. So now we have 2 drug approvals, and by now I mean within the last 12 months, there have been 2 different drugs approved, each of which is gene editing, which is a relatively new biotechnology. There are many clinical research projects now going on to try to make gene editing work for different diseases. And it has begun to work in these 2 clinical trials for sickle cell. The trial data is showing. So the FDA has approved the use of those. Now, there is a long way to go, but those kinds of science and the development of science is the reason research begins to accelerate. And the speakers before talked about more and more drug development companies deciding to research and put their investments into sickle cell research because of scientific advancements, where they see some promise, some hope, some chance of winning a drug approval that would help people. So gene editing isn't the beginning of that wave of interest. In the past several years, there have been other scientific reasons companies want to go into sickle cell research, which is good for sickle cell patients and their families. Melanoma is similar. The breakthrough drug approval for melanoma this year, 2024, I'm talking about, is described in this interview we're talking about. And Dana Dayton, who's the head of communications for the Melanoma Research Alliance, she talks about this drug approval, and it's not gene editing, it's cell therapy. So gene and cell therapy is often talked about in one comment. However, this is cellular therapy, highly individualized to the individual patient, and something which, again, is a new biotechnology which in this clinical trial worked enough to win an FDA approval. Now, we have a long way to go to see what are the long-term benefits of this, and also what other diseases will benefit from cellular therapy, the way melanoma seems to be benefiting. And Dana, in her talk, is also cautioning, it's good for us to know, this is not a cure for everybody with melanoma. She said many patients' versions of melanoma don't respond to this drug or to the other drugs that have been approved for other aspects of melanoma disease. So the research continues, but there is always a lot of hope and reasons to be positive about research when we see something working. And one of the reasons isn't just that it works, but also that more investment will come when something seems to be working. More companies will place their scientists on these projects. Cellular therapy might be seen as more generalizable to other diseases. And she also talks about the collaboration of the patient community in this kind of research and how important it has been. That is also generalizable to many diseases.
Definitely. I remember hearing Dana Dayton mention about 50% of those diagnosed with melanoma do not respond to the treatments that are currently available on the market. And we need to find those breakthrough therapies, which it seems like this is one of. So definitely glad to hear that we are advancing this. And we know with sickle cell, it's one of those diseases that you always find time to highlight, just transitioning from melanoma to sickle cell. These are two very distinct diseases that they don't get a lot of funding, I should say, when it comes to cures. And sickle cell in particular, it seems as though with the drug-seeking nature, it gets a bad rep in the ER. And how do you think, based on the patient forum and what you heard so far, how do you think the patients being more involved and the community being more engaged in this process, how can it help advance clinical trials and clinical research for those affected by these diseases?
It's very important to fight against stigma. Stigma is one of those things. You mentioned a bad rep and that's because patient advocates from the sickle cell community tell us consistently that sickle cell patients are often denied treatment when they go to the ER in a pain crisis. And sickle cell is characterized by pain crises. And the pain is acute and it's very bad. But because of the nature of the drugs they're seeking, and the word seeking I'm using in two ways, they need these, and that is the way that their pain crises are often treated. When really examined by expert physicians, they'll say, yes, this is a good use of opioids. But because we've had the opioid crisis in the US, they're often denied opioids because medical staff is trained not to give them and frequently not to believe patients when they say, I need it. But a sickle cell patient knows what they need. Now, I'm not saying they self-prescribe. I'm saying they know what sickle cell is. And people who know what sickle cell is, including their families, their physicians, the research scientists, know that this is a real pain that they're experiencing. Having said that, the hospital staffs are also trained to hold back opioids to protect people because there is a lot of addiction, including way outside any kind of relation to sickle cell disease. I'm talking about just the opioid crisis in general. So a few years ago, we interviewed Dr. Lakia Bailey, who heads the Sickle Cell Consortium, and she said, sickle cell patients are not the cause of the opioid crisis, but they are the victims of it because drugs they need are withheld from them. It is also pointed out by experts that one reason sickle cell patients are denied treatment or their treatment is delayed while they suffer in the ER, untreated and sometimes ignored, is because sickle cell patients tend to be brown and black people. And there is a lot of medical history, including current state, of brown and black people having their concerns overlooked, having their pain overlooked. And there have been studies that show a lot of medical people think that they're reporting phantom pain or they don't really experience pain, which is nonsense. But if you put all that together, you have staffs that they're taking the safe route, which is to avoid giving this patient treatment. And so this is a crisis. Now, really to get to the root of your question, how can we help research knowing these things? The speakers on our patient forum interviews we just talk about education about sickle cell and how important it is for the patient and the family who goes to the ER with that patient, or should, or if they can, be equipped with what it takes to educate the staff on site and not to assume the staff will understand what sickle cell is. One of the speakers talked about taking your patient records with you to demonstrate that you have this, that experience has shown it's better than just showing up. So this is the state we're in. And one of our speakers is an expert in community engagement, and she talks about how do we get hospital staff to be better trained about cross-cultural communication and to understand that when people come in from another culture or another way of living, or they look different because they're another ethnicity perhaps, how do we get our staff in a hospital to be really good at that kind of communication and not have everything always have to match patients up with, this nurse of an ethnicity being matched with a patient of the same ethnicity. What we really want to get to is that everybody who works in a hospital has been trained in cross-cultural communication so that real needs are not overlooked.
Definitely. This is a systemic issue. What stood out to me in what you said all great stuff, but sickle cell patients are not the cause, but the victims of the opioid crisis. And I recall hearing that in one of the past patient forums. And that really struck me when you said it, because it's tough when you're a victim twice. Didn't ask for the disease. But then when it comes to managing the pain and the symptoms associated, you fall victim or fall even further in this situation, which is really hard to manage. I love the notion of cultural education, educating everyone on the spectrum when it comes to community engagement. I also recall hearing in this last conversation that you had on the patient forum that some of the issue we're running into is that no one wants to be seen as a guinea pig, so to speak. And so there's a historical issue in the African-American community in particular, in sickle cell, where the patient wants to be active, but because of the lack of patient education and the lack of knowledge that the experts are giving the public, it's hard for them to willingly be involved in clinical research and clinical trials. Do you have any additional information to share with us around that? Were there any suggestions on how we can make that a better transition for some people who want to be involved?
Yes. So our speakers from the sickle cell community are Celicia Valentine, who spoke about her sister having lived until age 41 with sickle cell and her family, but she's also a professional in the clinical research industry and understands clinical trials and healthcare and hospitals. The other speaker, Professor Ramona H. Lawrence, who's a full professor at Georgia Southern University and teaches courses and also does consulting for organizations in community engagement. So engaging minority communities so that they will collaborate with you in health and in clinical research. And so she brings methodology to it and talks about different continua that you can look at how engaged is an individual or a community, how collaborative on a continuum, and how can you train people to move along the continuum to a more advanced state. And when you talk about people not knowing really about clinical research and maybe being scared by what they've heard in the past or what their community members are telling them about the dangers of being treated as a guinea pig. So in the past, there were atrocities, well documented and well discussed by people who live the clinical research life in terms of work, and those who have been in trials or in members of communities where it's discussed. But a lot has been done to change the regulatory process, the ethical oversight of clinical research, the way independent review boards overlook to see what's happening before it is allowed to happen, to make this a lot safer. And so that's what we need to educate the communities is in what way is this safer? And what these experts are all telling us, if you look at their interviews, is go into the communities and engage them early and educate them in places and in ways that they learn. Don't assume that all the education will be transmitted in a doctor's office or at the major medical center where the clinical trial is being hosted. Go into communities and then consider the culture in those communities and the way people communicate and absorb information from each other and from guests that are invited in. So that is very important, and a lesson, a call to action, I think, for everybody in the industry, whether it's a hospital that runs clinical trials or a pharmaceutical company or some kind of research organization, is to start doing that and start becoming really good at community engagement. Start down the path. Don't just wait until a clinical trial happens and then run into a community looking for patients to enroll.
Definitely. You spoke of some of the regulations that over time have been put in place. Tell us about the new law that's out right now that requires clinical trial sponsors to diversify their clinical trial. How does this law pave the way for other diseases and other clinical trials?
Yeah, so you're referring to the DEPICT Act, which is an acronym, Diversity and Equity in Participation in Clinical Trials, roughly stated. But the DEPICT Act requires pharmaceutical companies to submit a diversity action plan to the FDA to get permission to run their phase 3 or pivotal clinical trial. A pivotal trial is simply that phase of a trial that happens just before the drug is approved. And so it didn't used to be a rule that you had to submit a diversity action plan. There were a lot of companies that did clinical trials that knew how important that was already, but the law now requires it. And because the law is new, it took a while to come to fruition, and it's still new enough that its implementation is standardizing, and that usually takes some years even as companies start to comply with the law, the rules, the regulations, interact with the FDA. There are some glitches and problems and things people don't know how to do yet, but eventually it will standardize. And one of the things that companies are advised to do is get started. In fact, that advice was coming some years before the law passed, and the industry was talking a lot about it. Those who started engaging minority communities to participate in clinical research then know more about it now. The FDA has also said to clinical trial sponsors, we're new at this too, so as you're diversifying your clinical trials and writing up your plans, come to us with the problems you see. Help us understand your problems. We're new, you're new at this. But I think everybody would be well advised to move down that path and start becoming good at engaging minority communities or finding the partners who can help you with that. That will include folks already with relationships in communities, trust bearers. You need relationships with trust bearers, and knowing how to get a community to really understand your trial. And the last thing, that really kind of helps galvanize this point is communities will talk about the clinical trials that they are experiencing or the clinical trial people who have come to the community offering some kind of hope. They will talk. So you want to make sure that talk is positive if you have a clinical trial that is good for a community. Help them understand well the benefits to the community of those clinical trials, that this is for them. And without this kind of inclusion, they're being left out of the healthcare opportunity. But help them understand by bringing that information to places where they learn and giving it to them in ways that they learn.
So just to recap, the Patient Forum discussed new research in cell and gene therapy that directly impacts melanoma and sickle cell disease, new diversity laws. We're hearing a lot about community engagement and encouraging patients to get involved in their care, and experts to directly seek out engagement from the patient community. Did I leave anything out, Steve? What else can be found in the Patient Forum that we should highlight before closing out?
The Patient Forum interviews, we are in our 5th year now, or just completing our 5th year of Patient Forum interviews, and it's still ongoing. You can go back and see those. It's a free public website on wcgclinical.com/patient-forum. And you will see in going back some years, those interviews are still relevant today. Just because we recorded something in 2019 about diversity in clinical trials doesn't mean it's obsolete. it's very much what if folks had seen that then and taken the actions suggested would be ahead today, now that it's a requirement that they include diverse communities. And so all those interviews, no matter what they're about in the patient forum, are calls to action. They highlight a problem in clinical research that is of interest to patients and presents the solution. And even though some of these problems are almost insurmountable, the solution is presented by highlighting the voices of those, interviewing the folks who do in fact make the difference by taking that problem and doing something about it. So we're trying to show everybody else, here's what works. Don't look at these situations and say, that doesn't work. And we don't just talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion as we have a lot just now. We talk about biological sciences and some of the difficulties in getting the new science off the ground, the need to collaborate better with patient communities in doing that. We also talk about how patients sometimes talk about going to Capitol Hill to meet with their legislators on both sides of the aisles and to make sure that legislators understand what needs to change to help accelerate clinical research. Because a lot of what is done in the regulatory world comes from legislation. And legislation gets made and then it can last for years, but science is advancing all the time and things are changing and improving. We have better biological science, better methods, we have better computing. There's a lot of things that are better. And so we need our legislators to be caught up on it. And they don't come to Congress knowing these things. They need patient advocates to go use their voice. So that's also highlighted in the patient forum. We talk about pediatric diseases, we talk about diseases of the elderly and people in between, and we talk about also diseases that are difficult to create treatments for, but where there's a lot of research. I'm talking about, for example, neurological diseases. WCG has a lot of expertise, but we brought a lot of that out of the patient communities as well. Expertise in how does the research work in Parkinson's disease, in Alzheimer's disease, and other neurological disorders that are degenerative. And when the patients can't answer their own questions sometimes, but also sometimes you can't even meet with the patient, like during the COVID lockdown. There's a lot of complexity, but what we see is the research world moves ahead and keeps pushing and keeps moving. And there are things that can be done for those trying to research those diseases to give their research a better chance.
I can attest that there's a wealth of information in our patient forum repository covering a multitude of topics that are relevant to our patient population and our professional clinical research community. Before we wrap up, I want to thank you, Steve, for doing what you do, and also for joining us today and sharing your insights on this episode of WCG Talks Trial. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. If you have any questions or would like more information about this topic, please feel free to visit wcgclinical.com/patient-forum. We hope you found this episode insightful and that you'll join us for future episodes of WCG Talks Trials. Bye for now.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of WCG Talks Trials. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast on your preferred listening platform as we continue to explore different areas of the clinical research industry. As always, we encourage you to join in the conversation. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future topics you'd like to hear on the show by visiting us at wcgclinical.com/podcast. We're here to serve as a trusted resource as we work to improve lives and accelerate clinical research together.